Hello, and welcome to the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. My name is Claudia Rizzini. I'm the Executive Director of the Fellowship Program. The Radcliffe Institute brings together students, scholars, and practitioners from across disciplines and professions to create and share transformative ideas. You can participate in this laboratory of ideas by attending public programs such as this one, visiting virtual exhibitions, or pursuing the special collection held at the Schlesinger Library. To learn more about Radcliffe, please feel free to sign up to receive information on news and events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. We'll begin the program with a presentation by Alaa Murabit. After the presentation, the speaker will respond to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time throughout the program. We ask that you keep your questions brief to allow us to address as many as possible in the time that we have together. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Alaa Murabit. She is the United Nations High-Level Commissioner on Health, Employment and Economic Growth, and one of the 17th Global Sustainable Development Goals advocates appointed by the UN Secretary General. She is the leading global health and inclusive security expert. Nicknamed the Libyan Doogie Howser by Jon Stewart, Murabit was admitted to med school at Al-Zawiya University in Libya at age 15. Following her medical doctorate, she founded and spearheaded Voice of Libyan Women, an organization aimed at improving the political participation and the economic empowerment of women in Libya, as well as advocating against gender-based violence. She obtained a master's in international strategy and diplomacy from the London School of Economics. She has been an MIT Media Lab Director's Fellow and Global Ashoka Fellow. Murabit is the Executive Director of Phase-1, which provides thought leadership in conflict resolution and inclusive security. She also founded Co-Agency, an accelerator for emerging women's leadership in security, peacebuilding, and policy. Her TED Talk, What My Religion Really Says About Women, has been viewed nearly 7 million times. Murabit is the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including the New York Times Trust Women Hero, the BBC Top 100 Women, the Nelson Mandela International Changemaker Award. In 2018, she was awarded the Canadian Meritorious Service Cross, and in 2019, she was named one of the top 20 most influential people in gender equality policy and in the world. For her efficacy in security, health policy, and sustainable development, she was recently recognized as one of the 100 most influential women in history by the Canadian government. At Radcliffe, Alaa is working on a book entitled Architect of Peace, which examines the intersection of gender and securitization to argue that women's leadership in security is a prerequisite for a more sustainable world. At its core, the book argues that the potential of women as agents of peace is dramatically underutilized, with devastating consequences for equality, sustainability, justice, and peace of our planet. And now it is my pleasure to give the virtual floor to Alaa Murabit.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for such a warm and wonderful introduction. And thank you everyone for being here. I know it is a particularly anxiety-ridden day for many of us, especially listeners in the United States. And I am hoping, as I suppose everybody else on this call, that we end up having some good news at the end of it. I'm especially grateful for those of you who have phone banked and gotten out the vote and have really been championing democracy and participation. So, when Claudia gave a wonderful overview of Architects of Peace and what the purpose of this book really is, and how really not continuing to argue for the importance of women's inclusion and security because the data is there, and we'll talk about that today, but recognizing that we also need to be able to create tangible steps for a lot of those in office and power and positions of power that don't necessarily know how to ensure women's participation at all levels. And we're going to talk a little bit today about the difference between the instrumentalization or tokenization of women in security and conflict versus actually ensuring that their agency is that they're able to act on their own agency and that their interests and experiences are heard at equal footing and equal level. So I'll start from the very beginning on why I chose the name Architects of Peace for this work. The women's inclusion and security movement is often known and politically known as Women, Peace, and Security. And it's been 20 years, actually, this year, since the implementation of the first United Nations Resolution 1325, which said for the first time in history that women are equal partners in building and sustaining peaceful communities, and that they have unique risks in conflict that must be seen, that must be heard, that must be protected and resourced for. So it was the first time that politically we said women's participation is a non-negotiable. Now, over the course of the past 20 years, as you can imagine, politics has ebbed and flowed and sentiments around that have changed. But the movements and the power of Resolution 1325 remains very strong. So if you've seen this online, if you've read about it in class, it's probably been called Women, Peace, and Security. And I actually really love the name. I do. I think it's important for us to recognize and for us to verbalize through language that women are integral and important and critical for peace and security around the world. However, when we're talking about peace building with one another, not in a policy space, not attempting to say, okay, we need to propel this forward because it's never been heard of before, we also need to recognize that these things don't simply work in silos. And so it's not just about when insecurity exists. If there's active conflict, suddenly we need to engage women. No, it's about the fact that women, even in the absence of conflict, sustainable, that's an interesting phrase, policies, ensure greater action on things like climate change and environmental protection, ensure greater action on health and education. Right? And so it's not only about connecting women's inclusion to building peace in moments of insecurity, but it's about ensuring that we recognize that even in the absence of existing conflict, even in what is quote unquote a safe and secure, stable country, women's inclusion actually means much better outcomes for policies and for people. And so they really do architect the very framework of peace that we want our cities and our countries and our communities to thrive on. So you're probably wondering how I first became involved in this space, especially considering my own role as a medical doctor. I have long believed, that medicine is an incredible tool. It is, in my opinion, one of the most effective ways, and even empirically, one of the most effective ways to create and sustain peace, economic growth, sustainability, you name it. When people have health care, they are more likely to participate politically. They're more likely to participate in their local community. They're actually more likely to even trust their governments because there is that level of civic trust and a sense of reciprocation. So naturally, I wanted to become a doctor from a very young age. I was born and raised in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan in Canada. And it's okay if you don't know where that is. A little bit okay. You'll be surprised how many people ask me which country it is in. But when I was 15, I moved back to Libya, where I started medical school. I had known from about the age of 5 that I wanted to be a doctor. To me, the hospital was the only place where I felt beyond any, church or synagogue or temple. It was where I went and I saw, I think, the very best in humanity. You could go into a hospital chapel and people would be praying to different people from different backgrounds, religious, not religious, would be praying to a collective God, asking just for the very best, or praying, exchanging, bartering, negotiating, but always, I think, with a genuine sense of this is humanity at its most vulnerable, but also at its most honest. Right? When are we more honest than when we're in the hospital negotiating and bartering? And so I knew at that moment that if I could do anything to be part of that, if I could do anything to be part of people's answered hopes and dreams and wishes for their family, for their loved one, that's what I wanted to do. And at the age of 15, I started medical school. Now, when I was in my final year of medical school in 2011, the Libyan revolution broke out. And as par for the course in almost every conflict, especially modern day conflicts, hospitals are often one of the first places to be attacked, to be surveilled, often from both sides of a conflict in a civil war. In this case, it was most definitely from the side of the government. And at that point, myself, as well as many of my colleagues in final fourth and fifth year of medicine, as well as dentistry, began to work together to really organize in our own communities. Following the revolution, I decided to take that very ad hoc group and formalize it into an organization called the Voice of Libyan Women. And the purpose here was really to say throughout the revolution, we were called on, people said, okay, it's your job to help. If it was transporting gas, if it was making sure people were able to get medical equipment, if it was little things or big things, we were called on to help and to assist and to be part of the movement. And we were. I strongly believe that women really did carry the revolution on their shoulders. And yet almost immediately, when it stopped being about active conflict and it started being about political organization, and how are we going to share and split and control power, women were almost 100% excluded from the conversation. And the conversation started quickly changing to, oh, you guys were so helpful supporting and cooking for the troops or doing laundry, but do you really have the chops to understand the political ramifications or the nuances of building a nation state or rebuilding a nation state? And in that sense, VLW's first major project was a national conference called One Voice, where we brought together women's rights activists from around the country with political leadership, members of the National Transitional Council at the time, as well as the new Prime Minister. And together they sat down and looked at all of the major challenges, and it wasn't limited to only women's participation or inclusion, but we looked at, okay, resource allocation or religion, right? The rights of how we are going to look at religion in terms of rights-based learnings. We also looked at education, healthcare, infrastructure, transportation, and split those teams at tables so they could work together on really addressing these issues. What I learned very quickly on after about a year or 2 years doing this work, where we were really focusing on the political and economic empowerment of women, was that we were often seeing the exact same faces of women who were already excited and empowered and felt encouraged to become politicians or economic leaders, women who already fundamentally believed in their own agency and in the power of their agency. What we weren't seeing was families and women and girls who had resistance. They didn't show up to a lot of our talks. They didn't show up to our workshops. And so we began to ask ourselves, what is a conversation we're not having? Because clearly we're missing something if there's a lot of people missing from the room. It became very apparent to us, and predominantly through actually familial and personal conversations, that unless we started talking about the impact of religion on women's inclusion, it would be almost impossible for us to engage the vast majority of young girls and women. And it became incredibly important for us to actually counteract a lot of what was politically or economically or socially accepted as religious, because oftentimes, as we'll talk about today as well, religion does serve as a vessel for the increased economic, political, and social power of those in the ruling elite. And in Libya and around the world, those are men. So religion had often, families had often said, well, we can't negotiate with God, neither can you. And it became a priority of ours through the Noor campaign, and Noor means enlightenment in Arabic, to really look at, okay, then how do we shift the way we talk about faith? How do we shift the way we talk about women's roles in faith? And how do we leverage historical truths and empirical evidence that exists within our own religion to say, actually, women can and should be political and security leaders? And so we really began to look at the depth of information. And for me in particular, it was in Islam, where we looked at the Prophet's first wife, who funded the entire Islamic, Khadija radiallahu anha, who funded the entire Islamic community and movement in its infancy and while it was being sanctioned. We looked at Nusayba radiallahu anha, who fought alongside the Prophet in war. We looked at the truth that the Quran, which is the Islamic holy book, was left in the safety and security of a woman to protect it, and that hadiths, which are the sayings of the Prophet, have been transmissioned predominantly through women. So clearly, if the argument was that God dictated women's roles, then we should go based on the very first roles that existed in this faith, and that was faith. That those were roles of leadership, power, and guidance. And that unfortunately was not being replicated in our community. The Noor campaign quickly became one of the most powerful and effective campaigns. And it was really the first time we started talking about women, peace, and security on a national level. Prior to that, we'd had some ad hoc conversations when it came to the political inclusion of women or the economic empowerment of women. But here, for the first time, we were hearing from families in their own communities from 35 cities around the country. We had 35 different city teams saying to us, no, the biggest challenge for me getting engaged politically is because I don't feel like it's safe. Or the biggest challenge for me being, getting a job that late is the transportation, or these things which we don't necessarily talk about enough when we start engaging on women's inclusion in peace and security. From this, I would go on to be asked to be one of the advisors for the Global 1325 study, based on the success of our work in Libya and my advising other countries. And the Global Resolution 1325 study was a study that was conducted by the UN on the 15th anniversary of Resolution 1325 back in 2015. This meant that I would go internationally and have consultations, but it also meant that I would be at a lot of very high-level meetings at the United Nations. And here was where it became even more interesting to me, because up until this point, I began to think, we're potentially working kind of in a silo where every country really has to focus on its own cultural and social norms and policies and really challenge those. And we potentially couldn't create a very cohesive, regional or international strategy, because all our countries have such unique histories, politically, economically, militarily. And so I had began to really think that, based on a lot of consultations where most of the women's rights advocates and security specialists I spoke to would say, well, we're a little unique. You have to know these caveats. And it was also where I really feel that we've been unable to effectively work in many ways, because we often think things up in New York or London or Brussels or Washington and attempt to implement them in countries around the world without taking in input and ideas from the local communities themselves. So at this point, my core focus within the UN and also within my own organization and in all of the places where I had a role of power or leadership was to emphasize the importance of listening to the local community. For the local community not to simply be heard as an audience, but also to be architecting and part of the policies themselves, to be sitting at the agenda setting table with the same level of power and responsibility and ownership that any other counterpart had. And I really began to look at a lot of the research and a lot of the data behind it. You will learn very quickly, I think anecdotal storytelling is very compelling, but I think empirical evidence is what can change national budgets oftentimes. And we need to have both to be able to really move this agenda along. So the first time I went to my first very large UN meeting, where I was incredibly excited, I'll admit, I sat around a table and they etch your name into these wooden pieces. And I went and I sat in the seat that said Dr. Murabit, my seat. I pulled out my books, my papers, my pens. I had been doing research for 2 weeks. I came earlier than everybody else. I sent a message to my parents saying, wish me luck. I made a dua, which is a prayer, so that I would be understood and heard. And as I was, arranging everything in my very type A personality way, a young intern who probably only a few years older than me came up to me and said, excuse me, you're sitting in Dr. Murabit's seat. And I hear he's quite difficult. So if you could go, please sit in the back with the rest of the other support staff. And in a way that is actually very unlike my own norms, I picked up my things and I went to the back. And I spent the better part of the next 5 minutes confused why I even did that. And it wasn't until my colleagues came in and said, Alaa, why are you sitting back there? Come sit at the table, that I went and I took my seat. For the better part of the next 2 hours of this meeting, I sat there thinking of all the things I should and would have said in that moment. Now, I don't know how many of you have done this after you've had an argument or a debate and you spend the whole ride home or the whole time you're in the shower thinking of all of the awesome rebuttals you would have had to that person's comment. That is what I did instead of focusing on a lot of the conversation around me. After that meeting, the young intern came up to me before I could even approach her and said, I really want to apologize. I'm just not used to seeing people who look like me or you sitting at this table. Especially, she said, when the conversations around nuclear arms and our conversation specifically was on radicalization and violent extremism. She was saying, it's just not something that I'm used to, and I do have to apologize. And it was then that I decided, okay, the research is great, and sitting in spaces where we own and hold power and having these conversations is great. But how do we actually shift that theoretical knowledge of women, peace, and security, and women's inclusion, and the importance of women's inclusion, and all of the data we have behind women's inclusion into legitimate real-world application? And that's really where I began to focus. So if we talk about some of the data behind women's inclusion, we already know that when women are included from the agenda setting phase in security processes, they're 35 times more likely to last 15 years. Now you might be thinking 15 years isn't that much, except most of our peace processes, 90% fail within 5 years. So imagine all the times that you're sitting on the news, watching the news, listening to things about peace processes around the world. The amount of time it takes to go into them is often longer than they will even last. Now, another study found that including women in civil society groups in peace negotiation makes it 64% less likely to fail, even in the longer term. So when we talk about the importance of recognizing this, not only in conflict and kind of active fighting, active war, but also when countries are quote unquote stable, we also have to recognize that that's because our definition of stability or security has also expanded. We're not simply talking about, conflict that's farther from our homes like we were 100 years ago, nor are we even talking about emerging and recurrent armed conflicts or extremist networks or record levels of mass displacement like we were only 5 and 10 years ago. We're now also adding the caveats of the importance of social security and healthcare and that lens of human security, which we really haven't emphasized as much. And how when women are involved in those areas, we find significant increases, not only in people's overall quality of life, in the importance and in the resourcing of education and healthcare at a government and policy level, but also in the social framework itself. We find that citizens end up trusting their governments more. They end up actually feeling as though they belong more. They become more civically engaged, particularly those that are women and minorities themselves. Now, you're probably wondering, okay, great. This is obvious. We've seen the difference in response on COVID-19, where we know that countries with women's leadership have statistically been a lot more successful in reacting to the pandemic and in affecting the pandemic. But it goes beyond that, because unless we're actually investing in civil society from the onset, unless we are investing in women's political participation from the onset, unless we're ensuring that we're looking at those and saying, okay, how do we structurally shape our institutions to ensure the inclusion of women, and not only women, but ensure that we're having an intersectional inclusion of women across socioeconomic status, across education status, across race, and across orientation status, then how will we actually be able to have women's leadership in times of crisis? That only works if we've built a system where women can attain that leadership, where women can actually be in those positions of power. And that brings me to why it's so critically important and what my biggest recommendations for us moving forward are, and what I hope this book will really cement. Now, we can talk about, and my favorite one is education personally, because I do think that had it not been for my own education, I wouldn't be here today. And I would argue that the greatest equalizer and the greatest mobilizer and opportunity, foundation of opportunity around the world is education. Women and girls are statistically less likely to have an education around the world. And yet, when we look at the numbers, when we look at just numbers, this is without looking at anecdotal evidence. This is without, you can imagine the women in your own life and your own family tree and family history. Without even looking at that, if we look solely at the empirical evidence behind the education of girls and what that means in the long term, that alone, which we often do not put into the bucket of security, and I fundamentally believe it should be, which is why this book is being titled Architects of Peace. If we look at girls' education alone, and we were to equally educate and employ girls around the world, we would have a greater GDP growth than India and China combined. A girl who is educated is more likely to reinvest 90% of her income into the economy, as opposed to men who often invest 30 to 40%. She's more likely to ensure her children get medical attention. She's more likely to space her children. She's more likely to choose if, who, and when she wants to marry, marrying later in life. When we have educated, when we ensure the education of girls, and we ensure policies that act on the education of girls, that combined with women's reproductive rights are the two most cost-effective and practical solutions for climate change today. Now, it's mind-boggling because a lot of people say, well, you're putting a lot of focus on the education of girls, and we're talking about women, peace, and security. But, and I'm gonna move to questions right now. If we are going to talk about insecurity and conflict and the role that women should have in times of insecurity and conflict, the leadership role, the political role, the security role that women should have in times of insecurity and conflict, then we have to talk about how we ensure women's leadership can actually funnel into those spaces. We have to ensure that we're creating systems and institutions that support the leadership of women, that recognize the agency and not the instrumentalization of women, that we're not simply asking where are the women when conflict or insecurity happens, but we're recognizing that we have to invest in the education of women, in the health of women, for them to be able to achieve and reach those positions in the first place. I will turn it over to questions now and answer any and all of the questions that y'all have.
Thank you, Alaa. Thank you so much for this inspiring talk. We do have questions. How can we overcome cultural practices everywhere?
Cultural practices everywhere?
Yeah, this is a question from the audience.
I'm not sure what precisely the question is actually. I don't think all cultural practices are bad. So I'm not sure why we would need to overcome them all. I think many of us would hypothetically enjoy celebrating something like Halloween. I enjoy dressing my daughter up. That is a cultural practice. Many of us enjoy, at least, I do, Thanksgiving, or not Thanksgiving, but Indigenous Day dinner. I think many of us enjoy being able to collect with our families on certain holidays. So I don't think all cultural practices are bad. And oftentimes the only way that culture can shift or change for those practices that are harmful and are negative is by a collective effort from those who adhere to and create the culture itself. And so you'll notice that in our own history, when negative and harmful cultural practices have significantly changed. In part, it's brought on by an external factor. So there are opportunities, and we know that conflict is one of the biggest opportunities for shifts in cultural norms. So you can have, we talk quite a bit about the window of opportunity, for example, for gender equality in times of insecurity and conflict, where it can either go forward or backward, right? A shift in cultural norms can be positive or negative. And so conflict is definitely one of those areas where there's an opportunity for that. But internally, there has to be what we call in Canada the hockey stick approach, where it is around 30% of the population saying, we really need to change this, or we really want to change this. But I think we have to, or at least I hope I am in this book, and I urge others to be careful about how we define cultural norms. They're not all negative. culture can actually be very powerful in promoting change, in promoting equal rights movements, in sustaining and promoting gender equality. And it's really about which culture do we reinforce, which culture do we engage in, and which culture do we empower, which norms do we empower. But I hope that answers your question.
Mm-hmm. The following question. You have argued that women are integral to conversations about security, and you cited several studies in support of that proposition. Yet, I did not hear a clear articulation of why women's voices matter. And can you say more about the particular types of women's voice matter? Matters. If your framework and the values that inform your argument. Sorry, I have to read this question. And can you say more about the particular types of women's voices in your framework and the value that inform your argument? Without saying more, the claim that women's voices matter could be perceived as reductive.
So there's one particular reason why I don't emphasize or open with, okay, this is why women's peace and security is important beyond the empirical evidence. And it's the same reason why if I were giving a talk on climate change, I wouldn't say this is why climate change is real. I do think we as a movement of a political movement have to move beyond saying, okay, this is why equality matters, or this is why inclusion matters. I think when we start there, we give permission for the conversation to be about whether or not it's important in the first place, rather than the fact that it has to be important. Women are equal members of society. Women must be included. And then, of course, the data backs up why it is intelligent policy making, why it's intelligent leadership to ensure the inclusion of women. But I'll go beyond that and delve into this question a little bit more, because I actually think it's a question, particularly in today's political climate, that we need to have a bit more conversation about. When Women, Peace and Security was first being passed in the early 2000s, in 2000, a lot of the conversations had moved beyond why women's inclusion was important, because there was immediate evidence of what happened when women weren't included and what happened when they were. Some good examples were the Rwandan genocide, the Bosnian genocide, of course, as well in the early 2000s, conflict in Liberia and how women surrounded the building to ensure that peace processes moved forward. In the years since, we've actually seen incredible examples of women's leadership in security and in conflict. Again, the Ebola pandemic and the impact that had, and the fact that a lot of international institutions, a lot of governments really failed to recognize the importance of local context and local history when it came to treatment for Ebola. And it was the local women leaders who actually took that on and said, no, sending in an armed military in a country that recently came out of civil war is going to be incredibly dangerous. We need to take this head on. And so the approaches were fundamentally different. So we also have to add a second caveat here, which is a question I get asked often, which is, okay, well, if women were leading every country in the world, would the impact still be the same? Would the results be the same? If women were the dominant factor in peace processes and security, and it was men who were coming in at less numbers and oftentimes negligible numbers, would the statistics be different? Would women have as much impact? And my argument here, and why I think women's voices matter, full stop, is because it's not necessarily just about women. When we want policies that work for communities, the people around the table creating that policy need to represent the community you want that policy to work in. If you have 100% women, it's not going to represent the community that you want that policy to work in. So it makes perfect sense when you look at the data that those policies would fail. They don't have buy-in because they don't have credibility, because they don't actually reflect what the community needs or perceives or experiences on a daily basis. Statistically, when women are included, they are able to talk about and bring to the table at the agenda setting phase fundamentally different things than any other group. They're the most likely to talk about transportation, infrastructure, schools, education, healthcare. They're more likely to talk about really what we call those founding blocks of peace building. That is not to say they alone would be able to create and sustain, and if every country were led by women, there would be no conflict. No, it is to say that in the same way most people would have a problem with 90% peace processes led by women, we have to recognize that 90% peace processes led by male do not reflect the societies in which they are meant to support, govern, or maintain peace. So unless we actually represent those around the table, and when you talk about which particular women or type of voices matter, I think that's also incredibly important to say. It's not about, okay, we're going to have 40 or 50% women, and we're not going to talk about the composition. In the same way, we should also be challenging the composition of men around the table, saying this should reflect the societies in which it operates. When we have decision-making tables that look like the communities they serve, then we'll be on the right path. Next question.
Great. I guess following on from the previous questions, one question is, are women leaders more successful because they are new to it? And I guess later on, could women prove to be, as successful or not as men in power at a later when they've been at it for a while?
Well, I wonder how we define successful. How are we defining successful? How have men been successful in power? Is that successful in maintaining and controlling power? I think so. First, there's a couple of things. I appreciate that question a lot, actually. Thank you, Claudia, because it's one that I get asked often. And I think it's a very important question. We don't have any real data behind whether or not it is only because they are new to it. That is an argument, and it could very well be part of it, right? It should and most likely is part of it, because they don't. And we know, even for example with COVID-19, when a lot of masculine leadership was seen as having to be strong and tough on this virus, a lot of women leaders did not necessarily have to fit that same socially accepted bill. They didn't have to be seen as brute strength and as more dominant. And they've spoken to that, right? And we've seen that in our research in the past as well. So I definitely think that could be a component of it. There is, there's a significant amount of power there's a significant amount of social power when it comes to having women in leadership, because they are the rare, they are not, they're the exception, not the rule. Once they become the rule, how does that look? I don't know. My argument is, though, that let's see. Right? Let's have more women in power and let's see how it changes. Because as long as we are creating, decision-making tables and political movements that actually reflect the societies that we live in, that are not disproportionately one group or another, I actually think we're only going to be more effective at maintaining peace. That brings me to the second part of the question, which is, would they be like men in power? Power and peace are two very different things, in my opinion. And Architects of Peace goes into this quite a bit. How we define power is very culturally and socially dictated, but it's also very masculine. It is a sense of control. It's a sense of ownership. It's a sense of dictation. It's not necessarily the same way we look at feminine qualities of leadership, like compassion or listening. And so and a good example would actually be, if you remember back in, I think it was 2014 or 2015, Hillary Clinton did a listening tour around America. And a lot of the media was like, well, why is she doing a listening tour? That's not powerful. This is just typical. It's not powerful. Why is she listening? And it was an interesting framing, like public framing of what we see in politics very often, which is that we define power by certain norms. And I think one of the biggest strengths of women's inclusion in peace processes and conflict is actually that we might shift what power looks like. And we might look at other leaders like Jacinda Ardern now, and say, okay, no, that's legitimate power. That's what it looks like. And we might redefine what the very kind of qualities and components that we need for, powerful leaders looks like. That's a hope.
The next question, Alaa, could you say more about the relationship between girls' education and climate change?
Yes. So I actually highly recommend a book called Drawdown by Paul Hawkins. It was edited by Paul Hawkins, by I think over 100 climate scientists came together to do the research and to work on it. And it's actually where, they've looked at everything from small farming to energy, green energy and alternative sources of energy, and really came out with with the research that it was women's reproductive rights and girls' education, which were the most cost-effective and practical solutions. And the reason for that is because one thing we do know is we can always attempt to reduce our energy use. But the reality is the population is growing. And this is not to say that the population shouldn't grow, but it is to say that every girl should have the choice and the opportunity to choose when and if and how many children she wants to have. And when girls are educated, they are able to make that decision for themselves. They are able to choose when and if they want to marry. They are more likely to have economic power to choose not to marry at a young age. And more importantly than that, they're able to choose if and when they want to space their children. Beyond that, they're also able to have less children because they are more likely to use vaccines and medical treatments and health treatments in general for their children. So a huge part of it is recognizing that the chain effect that girls' education has on their economic, political, and social power.
Great. Following on actually on that comment, how would you recommend we operationalize empowering women leaders in our local organizations? I work for a nonprofit healthcare organizations where most of the leadership is male. How do we create systems to develop and uplift female leaders in this space?
This is such an excellent question because first and foremost, it's not rare for us to find institutions where the bulk of the workforce or a significant portion of the workforce, particularly non-managerial, is women and the leadership is male. That's very common. Healthcare is actually a very good example of it. And the reality is recruitment in many of these spaces, particularly in developed countries, is actually not as difficult as retainment. Retaining women employees actually tends to be more difficult than recruiting them in these spaces. And so I think the most important part within our own local organizations, and I think this is what we can all do within our own institutions, organizations, educational institutions, et cetera, what we all need to do and should be doing is looking around the room and seeing who's absent and seeing what some of those policies we can do are. And in the same way, if this was a country conflict, I would say go and speak to local women civil society. It is go and speak to the women frontline workers in your organization. Ask them what is needed. Ask them what is needed to ensure that they would like to retain those positions and advance within them. Ensure that there is an actual system and structure that supports them, because it's not about empowering or operationalizing the empowerment of women. I think women don't need to be empowered. They have incredible agency, but it's true that we need to be building institutions and structures that reflect and recognize the importance of women's inclusion. And so there are clearly deficiencies in the organization itself. And the people who will tell you those deficiencies most effectively are those most impacted. So go to the frontline workers and say, hey, what is missing? What is unacceptable about the workplace for you? What is uncomfortable about the work? Do you see yourself in a management role within this institution? Why or why not? And you'll find that they will tell you things that some are very difficult to hear, but they'll say, no, I actually don't. It's not flexible work, or I find this place to be very patriarchal or sexist, racist, etc. Whatever it might be, whatever those outcomes are, you'll find that those most impacted will be the best voices to really let you know. And then when you go to looking at how do we actually create those systems after you have the information, because step one is getting the information and seeing what you need to change to make it a better system. The second step is ensuring that they weren't just a conversation you had, right? That you went to them only when you needed information and then went up to management and worked with predominantly men to try to shift things around, because that wouldn't work. In order for it to be truly transformational and to ensure that it goes through the entire institution and structure, you need to ensure that they're sitting at equal footing and equal power with those in management to be able to reshape that institution. So I think first and foremost, listen to those most impacted in the community. And second, ensure that you are bringing them into the decision, that they are in the decision-making rooms, that they have equal footing in terms of power and privilege and decision-making as those in more formal authority if you truly want to transform an institution or a community or a country.
That's great. Can you speak to the impact of having more women in medicine?
To a degree, I think it's important. So To a degree. Medicine has actually, in the past traditionally had women's leadership, and medicine, and this is, I suppose, depending on which part of the world you live in, because in countries like Libya, women outnumber men vastly when it comes to medicine. I think in the United States, it's close to equal, if not higher. And so it's not necessarily only about having people within that space, it's about where their leadership, where their power is within that institution, within that industry. And so the previous question we had about, yes, we have a lot of frontline workers who are women, and a lot of management and leadership that is men. It reflects a lot of truth that exists in medicine today. We have a much higher percentage of women in medicine than we have in the past. But if you look at management, if you look at hospital ownership, if you look at those who continue to make the decisions, they don't reflect the gender difference when it comes to medicine as a whole. They don't. It's still predominantly male. And so I think one part is to ensure the inclusion. The other part, and I'm grateful to the last question for asking it, is how do we shift our institutions to reflect what the makeup looks like? And medicine is one of the spaces which is the most, in my opinion, archaic probably isn't the best word, but it's the only word that's coming to mind right now. Very set in its ways in terms of the inclusion of women and existing power dynamics, assumptions around what kind of medical professional or practitioner has more authority, legitimacy, credibility, conversations around nurses, midwives, doulas, treatments of different groups, technicians, et cetera, within medicine. I think there are a lot of conversations that need to be had in medicine. And I think the only thing that will spur them on around gender equality, around racial equality, I think the only thing that will spur a lot of those conversations on is the inclusion of more of those more women and people of different socioeconomic and racial status entering medicine in higher numbers and forcing a lot of those conversations. That has yet to happen in, I think, the numbers many of us would hope.
Right. Changing directions here. Can you speak about backlash that happens after the peace builder leave the conflict site and how best to prepare for it?
Sorry, can you repeat that question? The backlash that happens?
Of course. Can you speak about the backlash that happens after the peace builders leave the conflict site and how best to prepare for it?
So that's actually, I think the best way to prepare for it is ensure that peace builders are part of the community. Peace builders in a community should not be external. They should not be from another country. They should not be from another institution. They shouldn't be from the UN. They should be from within that community. They should be supported and amplified and through international mediators and through institutions. But conflict is a lot less likely to reoccur in a community if those impacted by the conflict live in the community. That's in my opinion, and the data shows it. When we have local women, civil society, people who understand, are part of the community, are really invested in the overall security, shaping those peace processes, they're more likely to last. If you think about your own home, if somebody came in and said, okay, you know what, we're gonna, what's the best example? Conflict in your own home, and you had someone come in and say, okay, we're going to split this. This is how it's going to work. And that person leaves. Within a day, 2 days, a week, you might go back to the exact same actions and, aggressions that you had previously, because there's nobody there that's actually going to be impacted by the peace remaining and the peace lasting. Whereas when you do have women who are part and parcel of that, and the best example I can give is probably my mom, when we would have active conflict, when she left the room after splitting us up, we were fighting in about 2 minutes flat. But if she stayed in the room, if she was there, if she was part of the conversation, if she was making dinner in the kitchen or helping us with homework, then it was a lot less likely, and we would actually usually move on to having different conversations. So I don't think it is possible to maintain peace if those most invested in the peace are not involved in building the actual peace processes, because then whatever document comes out is going to reflect the interests of usually armed militias, who we always invite to peace processes, because we assume if you have a gun, you have a right to be around the table, not if you've been building civil society, et cetera. And oftentimes actually international or regional interests. If they don't reflect the local interests, I don't think peace can last.
Next question. I found your discussion on ensuring that the communities affected by policies are sitting at the table when they are designed very compelling. I was wondering, how do you approach differences of race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, and so on within the category of women? In other words, women are not a monolith.
Yes, no, I completely agree. I think the most important thing that I've had to remind myself when having this conversation um, is it's very difficult to approach different groups, be it race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, etc., if there is no trust with those groups. And I do think, and this is not unique to the women's rights movement. This is across the board. This is something that impacts, I think, all of our politics and all of our leadership tables. But I do think it's difficult to engage people on women, on peace building in a community if they feel as though they're not active and equal participants. I don't think they'll stay. Statistically, they don't. And it's that tokenization component, that instrumentalization, where suddenly we see, okay, a lot of women of a particular religion being brought out on a panel or in a conversation on issues that people deem specific to that faith, or people of a different specific ethnicity or specific race, and only at that time do we hear those voices. And that simply can't work, because it doesn't build trust, but also it tells those communities that you are only important and your voice only matters if this issue is stereotypically connected to your community. So, and it's happened to me, I would argue, almost minimum once a week since I started this work, where if there's a conversation around Islam, or there's a conversation around the Middle East, or there's a conversation around violent extremism, the automatic assumption is like, well, we should talk to her. She definitely knows, without recognizing that actually my expertise is in very different areas, and that stereotypical assumption based on my how I look, my ethnicity, and my religion is actually detrimental to the overall outcomes of our peace processes. So I do think the most important thing is, within our own institutions, women's leadership and women peace and security organizations have to start looking around the table and saying, what is the makeup of the women around the table? As much as I ask, what's the makeup of the men? This is not unique to women, but because it's a daily reality for us, it's a question that I think we have to ask. And over the past 15, 20 years, oftentimes there's been an argument, okay, we just need to get women there first, and then we'll talk about composition. Like, let's just get women there. Okay, and then we'll ensure that there's racial equality, and we'll ensure that all ethnicities and religions and socioeconomic status, et cetera. And in my opinion, that's actually very detrimental, because then oftentimes the policies that come out aren't as transformational, because they don't reflect the very communities that we're talking about. So as representative as we can be within our own nonprofits, our own education systems, our own institutions, then that can actually be reflected in policy. I wish it was believe me, I wish it was some sort of easy kind of silver bullet solution. But power is, at the end of the day, women's inclusion, women's rights are about power. And power can be very attractive and compelling. And power is not unique to men. The desire to want, hold, and maintain power is not unique to men. And within the women's rights movement, we have to talk about, I think we should be talking more about, and more openly about, and more compassionately about the reality that power is held and maintained and dictated by a particular group of women. And until we have more open and honest conversations about the dominance that particularly white women have had in the women's rights movement, in defining the agenda, in gatekeeping who else gets to be in the room, I think it'll be very difficult for us to have legitimate, credible, and honest conversations about women's inclusion as a whole, because the communities that we're serving will not trust us. They will not believe us. They do not see their leadership at our tables. And so as much as the women's rights movement very fairly says, okay, we need to have women included in peace processes and security and political leadership and educational leadership and every form of leadership top to bottom, then I think the women's rights movement does need to look in the mirror and say, which women are not in this room? Because statistically, it's a devastating reality. So So I think power transcends gender and the desire for power. And I think it's time we have more honest conversations. And I'm very excited by the movements of this year, because I think for the first time in a long time, those conversations are happening much more openly, and they are being heard in a different way by those who do hold power. So I think that's incredibly important. I hope I answered that question and it wasn't a complete Debbie Downer of an answer.
It was fine. One more question about women and women in leadership. So many of the prominent leadership roles of women today are held by young women. Do you have any comments about the roles of older women in leadership roles?
I actually don't know many of the prominent leadership roles that are held by young women. What is our definition of young? When we look at relative to the global population, that's actually not accurate. We don't have, for example, a lot of young women holding political power in the same way as we do and I wouldn't say older, but older women. So I'm not quite sure I agree with the sentiment. But that being said, I will talk about the importance of an intergenerational dialogue within the women's movement as a whole, and then within politics more widely. So when it comes to really there has been, in particular, I'd say the past 15, 20 years, more concentration given to, okay, how do we ensure that, a lot of the experience and the wealth of knowledge and the initiatives that older women have done within this movement don't wash, right? How do we ensure we're not replicating it, we're not rehashing the wheel, et cetera? And there's also been a conversation, I think, among young women about how do we ensure that we are part and parcel of these conversations. That a lot of, and this reflects, I guess, to the previous question, that a lot of older women who have held and maintained and owned these positions of power within our movement ensure that space is created and shared and power is shared, right? And I don't have a very, I think, definitive answer for this, because it's something I've grappled with myself. When I was 21, I started my movement, and I will be honest in telling you that one of my biggest challenges, arguably my own biggest personal contention with the women's movement, was the exclusion of younger voices, the assumption that we would only be shopped out for youth consultations, without recognizing that we had an incredible amount of agency and power. And this was back in 2011, so the amount of conversations people would ask me about social media mobilizing, no idea, right? But I was the youngest person in the room, and so automatically that was assumed to be the role I should fulfill. And the amount of times I've been asked about TikTok in the past 6 months is hilarious, because I have no idea. So I think it's important for us to recognize that we, in our own movement, stereotype amongst one another and say, okay, well, and we do gatekeep, and that goes across, I think, intersectional lines as much as it does intergenerationally. So I highly respect and appreciate the work that women have done. I don't think any of us would be here. I know I wouldn't be here if it had not been for the incredible women leaders who came before us. But I also think it's incredibly important for us to recognize, like in every effective movement, there has to be a transition of power. And leadership is not about how long you maintain or hold a position or how many followers you have, but it is about the kind of power, transformation, and level and volume of leaders that you're able to create. And so one of the biggest recommendations I have across the board for young and for older women is find a mentor. Your mentor does not have to be older or younger than you. They can be whatever you need. And so many of my mentors are younger than me. So many are older than me. But find a mentor where you can have a lot of these open conversations with, because a lot of us come with this baggage into the communities that we serve. And this goes for young men and older men as well. But have someone that you can go to and say, hey, I'm having a challenge with this. I don't want to be dismissive of her experience or her work or her life's work or her leadership, but I also want to be seen as an equal and a partner. How do you think I can approach this? Because I think the more that we create women's rights organizations and political movements that reflect the reality of the world we live in, the better off we be. And the reality of the world we live in is that we have a much younger population than is reflected in our political and economic leadership today. So unless we have more young people in it, our policies are not going to reflect them at all.
Thank you. Thank you, Alaa, for a thoughtful presentation and great perspective in your Q&A. I also want to thank you, our audience, for the terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. With that, I thank you all again very much for joining us today. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much for having me.